I'm Carol Taylor. In this episode of Journal, we turn the camera around and we're going to put the spotlight on the media. Now, where do you get your news these days? How do you know if it's true? Is print really headed to the graveyard to be replaced completely by digital media? And what about local news? Now, obviously, I'm biased. I've spent most of my career in television news and public affairs. But surely I'm not the only one searching for information beyond 30-second sound bites or newsreels that repeat every half hour. My son, who's a successful business writer in the States, he laughs when he tells the story of how I tried to discourage him from going into journalism. That is not what a mother is supposed to do. But I could see even then, magazines were disappearing, papers were shrinking, and there were fewer opportunities in television for talented young journalists. Today, of course, the situation has deteriorated. CBC's cutting jobs and eliminating vacant positions. CTV is cutting many local news broadcasts. Small regional papers are going belly up. And even some of our national print sources are getting very thin or only publishing 5 days a week. So where are we? What is the role of media in our society today? And does it matter? Joining me to analyze the media landscape is Stuart McNish, who started his career as a reporter for BCTV News, and then 25 years ago moved into the video and television production side with his company, Oh Boy Productions. Back in a moment. Welcome back. So, Stuart McNish, what is your overall assessment of the media landscape these days?
Well, I think it's in transition, and maybe it's fair to say that it's always been in transition. Media is not a guaranteed this is the way that it's supposed to be, poured into cement institution that is a pillar of society. It's called the fourth estate, but it isn't like government and the courts. It is something that is constantly in flux, and we protected it as though, or we think that it's supposed to be this divine right, but it's something that has to be nurtured, supported, and it has to make business sense.
Am I wrong when I have the feeling that it's in fact going backwards? It's really diminishing and becoming less of a factor in our society?
Well, it's definitely contracting, and the impact of it has changed. And a big part of that, I find, is that even if you do a major explosive story, the long tail of that is now really short. At one time you could do in-depth journalism. Let's say when you were at W5, you would do an in-depth piece, you'd put it out there, and for the next week, that piece was generating its own news. Well, you might be lucky if you get a mention the next day, but by the day after that, poof, it's disappeared. So it's not like media's gone away, but the way in which it plays itself out is so dramatically different. So you take into consideration that you don't have the long tail of a story that's going to give you extra coverage, and you start to say, well, it costs a lot of money to do that, and I don't have the money. So the shift is definitely underway, and it's clear that the impact has also changed because those major stories lose their relevance so quickly.
Well, let's look at print, because that's a pretty obvious example of diminishing availability. I found that I'm a print person, so in the morning, that's how I like to get my news. And really, there's very little in there. And an editor, actually, a former editor of a newspaper said, Carol, why are you doing it? It's just a snapshot, a screenshot of yesterday's news. Is it really completely on its way out in terms of being print and something we touch?
I think for many publications, you would say that that's true. But there's always going to be some exceptions, like major papers, even though they may not be as robust or as thick as they used to be. I mean, remember you used to get like the Sunday or the Saturday edition, and it was like this. Well, now you're lucky if it's got multiple pages at times in some sections. That's because the nature of everything is changing. And so much of that is driven by what's the business model. What supports the good journalism is money, and the money equation has changed quite dramatically.
In what way?
Well, there used to be sort of three pillars, especially in print. You wouldn't say the same was true in radio and television, but there were three sort of pillars of the financial model for newspapers. There was classified ads, and I say classified ads first because classified ads made up to about 40% of revenue for newspapers. And then you had like display advertising and subscriptions. Well, along comes Craigslist, basically. It wasn't the first that started to pick away at the classified ad section, but Craigslist really took and destroyed classified advertising on newspapers. And it took billions of dollars, not millions or hundreds of millions, billions of dollars that went to Craigslist, but now came out of newspapers. And that money, so much of it, helped to fuel journalism. Now what's interesting is we've allowed that to happen in Canada and the United States and other places. But you go to Mexico. Mexico said, no, we're not going to let Craigslist take that classified ad business. You still have to advertise on the paper. And so then that helps to support, interestingly enough, newspapers in Mexico, whereas we're not doing the same thing here.
So that was one of the stools. Subscriptions is another one, and that's diminishing too. Why would that be diminishing?
Well, it's an interesting sort of like double-edged sword. I mean, remember, this is a business. So you see diminishing revenue here, and you go, well, we still have subscriptions. Let's up the cost of that subscription. Well, subscribers go, well, just a second, I'm getting less of a paper because I can see it diminishing, but you're charging me more? Well, a lot of people started canceling their subscriptions because here's a big part of the problem in supporting media. Consumers really don't want to pay for it. It's like, I want you to give it to me and I want you to give it to me for free. But they don't want to pay for it.
And so your business model you're talking about, if you're going to have good journalists, you've got to have them on your payroll.
Yeah.
So even if they go to digital, they still have to be paying journalists, don't they?
They do. And so they still have to have a revenue model. And so you go, well, what about display advertising? So here's the interesting thing. You go, okay, well, I'll go display advertising on digital. Well, for the advertiser, they're not getting the same bang for their buck as they did when they printed it. And so you look at a newspaper going, okay, well, let's get rid of some of those legacy costs, like the printing press and all those, fairly good, high-paying jobs that we can cut from our bottom line. But you're not delivering quite the same product to the advertiser, so they go, well, I'm going to pay you less. Coupled with that, of course, is they go, I need you to be more specific. Like, I need you to target single female, 35 years of age, physically active, mother of two, career woman. Well, newspapers in the paper can't deliver that kind of specific or precise distribution the way that like the giants can.
Well, if you look at television, that's where we both started.
Yeah.
The same issues don't really apply there, do they? Why is it cutting local broadcasts and cutting W5 and cutting enormously?
Well, once again, though, it is a diminishing role of advertising, coupled with an explosion of competition for your eyeballs. And it used to be that you couldn't get your news other than by like appointment. You had to be there at 6 o'clock at night or 10 or 10:30 or 11, whenever it was. Well, I don't need to do that any longer. So part of the problem with both radio and TV is I don't need to be there listening on the hour or the half hour or at 6 o'clock to get the news. I know you're going to record it and I can get it sometime later. Or if you're doing like, let's say the papers are, because they've adjusted. They used to, the newspaper used to be the last source that you went to. You got radio, then you got TV, then it went to the newspaper. Well, newspapers went, okay, now that we're online primarily, like so much of our news is online, they've jumped to the head of the queue. And they'll go, well, the story broke at 10:05. At 10:05:30, we're putting it on TV. Well, the radio station is still stuck to like, let's say a 10:30 broadcast, and the television, well, it's like noon before they come up with it. It's old news by then. And so their model is changing in the fact that they're losing eyeballs. And so when they start to lose eyeballs, they lose audience. They start to lose the revenue that comes from the advertisers. They want to be in front of those eyeballs. It's, it comes down to what's the business model, because it is the business model that funds good journalism. And let's be fair, there's still some great journalism happening in this country.
One thing that I think just seems to be decimated is local news. When something happens, and we've both been near an explosion when it happened in downtown Vancouver, and we're immediately going on the internet trying to find local news. What just happened? We didn't get it for about a day and a half.
Yeah, that's because there's no reporters on the ground. Nobody's scanning the police scanners. They're just not there. And so this is also the role of the internet, in the sense that it has robbed classical or traditional newsrooms of the resources they need to be able to do that. So once again, then the volume, the quantity, the quality of the information that you get starts to diminish. So then you're going, well, I can't rely on that, and I can't even go to the internet to get an update on a major traffic accident. One good thing on radio that they still have is somebody phoned in, there's an accident on the highway, avoid that, take this route. But even there are apps that are even more responsive, and they start telling you well in advance of things that are going on. So media is competing with so many other venues that make it really difficult.
And some of the venues are podcasts, which I know you're involved in. We'll come back and talk about that. Welcome back. I mentioned podcasts because I know in your studio you do a number of podcasts. What I don't understand about this world is there seem to be thousands of podcasts. So how do you find what you're looking for?
Well, this has been an age-old question. We think, it's new and unique to podcasts. It's not. I was doing a little bit of research, and you go back to around the time of the American Revolution. There were these publications called news weeklies, or they had a name, something like that. And there were thousands of them in the United States. And they were all basically opinion pieces. And they were yapping on about this that they didn't like about the government or the king and whatnot. And of course, it helped to fuel the propaganda that supported the American Revolution. And then when they started to write the Constitution, Andrew Jackson went, yes, we have to secure the freedom of the press. Let them, be out there. By the 1800 or so, there were like 2,000 of these things in the United States. And it's still just a tiny little country. And back then, as we do now, there's far more podcasts, of course, but you, as a consumer of news, have a responsibility to start to listen to it with a critical ear or a critical eye. Is this news that I can trust? Who is this person that's hosting this or offering their opinions? Is what they're saying credible? Just because people throw the information out there doesn't mean that it's landing quite the way that you might think it will. It will affect some audiences, but not everybody as a whole. So there's a part in here that is incumbent upon the listener.
It's very tough, though. Think of during COVID and all of the chatter about vaccines that was going all over the internet and podcasts. How you find truth these days is really a difficult one. And I sort of laugh when people say, well, journalists are all objective. There's no such thing, is there?
No, there isn't. I remember when I first started in journalism, I was actually quite perplexed by this problem. I went, what do you mean I'm objective? I can't help but look at what's going on through the lens of my own life. This is where I live. These were the things that influenced me. This is what I determine is important, and I leave those things out. And it's not because I'm trying to color the news, but I am a product of my life. And what I found interesting is I watched this fascinating interview with Peter Jennings at the time, as I was just coming into my career. And he basically said, when you take a look at a story, no matter what story it is, you can't tell the whole story. It's not possible. You would have to have pages and pages and pages or hours of airtime or whatnot to really fully tell a story. So as a journalist or as a producer or an editor, you're constantly making decisions about what goes in the story, what doesn't. What am I going to focus in on? I remember when I was in journalism school, we had this instructor named Jennifer Naklis. She was as tough as nails, best instructor I ever had. Because what she did is she said, you have to understand the medium that you're working in. At this moment, you can only tell one story. And that would only be an element of one piece. So you'd pull out a piece of information, and then you'd open it up like this, and you'd go, there, that's the story that I'm telling. But you represented it as though it's a part of the whole. Viewers don't really seem to comprehend that this is only one piece of a much larger story. And the defense against that was, well, it's incumbent upon the consumer of the news to do more research. The challenge is, in our society, people haven't done that. In other societies, they go, I don't believe that, it's government propaganda or it's business propaganda. And I think that in some ways we're getting more towards that. But I think that it's important that we all go, somebody will say, oh yeah, I saw this thing in the news, and you go, what news? Who was the author? What was the point of view? Who did they talk to? That we have to be discerning. And I know that I'm living in a utopian paradise where we all have the time to do that, but we do have a responsibility ourselves if we want to be informed.
Well, I've had the joy and privilege of working in the two professions that are always the lowest on the trust meter.
Oh, yes.
And that's journalism and politics. I mean, there's just a lack of trust by people, and I think it's because there has been so much misinformation or slanting of the news by politicians, slanting of the issues. So what do we do about all this bias that's now embedded? If you're looking at television stations, and if you're in the States, you know where Fox News is. It's right over there. They're speaking to the right-wing agenda. If you look at MSNBC, they're way over here, and they're speaking to their agenda. So none of those viewers are getting the whole story. And what do? Like, do you just keep channel switching and trying to get various versions of what's going on and then put it together?
Well, it depends on how well you want to be informed, because, we also see that through Google, which is still delivering news here in Canada. Facebook isn't.
What do you mean Facebook isn't?
Facebook, here's an interesting thing. Did you know that Facebook actually has Facebook News?
No.
And if I know, you really got to go looking for it. And they say, oh yeah, no, we're out there supporting journalism. Yeah, they support the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and a few others and whatnot. But to find it, and so I went looking for it. Can't view this in Canada. Well, what about CBC? Can't view it in Canada. Global TV, can't view it in Canada. Globe and Mail. Like, they blocked it all, and they say right up there, we're doing it because we're frustrated with the government of Canada. So they're actually even just blocking news. But let's say you're doing your searches through Google. They're not blocking news any longer because they worked out some deal with the Canadian government that seems to work for some news organizations, but it's literally killing the small publications because they're not getting exposure any longer. But you go and you start typing in, oh yeah, I want an article about tennis. Well, very quickly, once you start to go sports, Google's already determined that you like tennis. It moves tennis up and pushes football way down, or vice versa. So you're being manipulated about what you can and cannot get. They don't stop you from finding them, but you got to push the extra step. And so I think that as viewers, we have a responsibility if we want to make informed choices. But, it comes back to that. I keep thinking about Teddy Roosevelt's speech at Sorbonne University back in 1914 called Citizenship in a Republic. And he talked about the fact that as a citizen, you have a responsibility to be an active participant. You can't just say, well, I'm going to abdicate that responsibility to you and trust that you're going to, treat that relationship with the utmost care and respect.
Well, I think it's good to talk about responsibility of individuals, but I think media, at least in my old-fashioned mind has a responsibility towards things like bringing people together and bringing our country together, rather than do what I see too often, which is, okay, I'll get someone who's way over there in their opinion, I'll get someone who's way over there in that opinion. Now I've covered everything. Well, you haven't done anything about the middle or where most of us are at.
Right.
And I think media has abdicated that responsibility.
Well, sure, because they need the clicks, they need the eyeballs, and so they're going to go where they get that response. You know, and coupled in with that, like earlier on, I was talking about the fact, like, you put a huge effort into a big story. Well, what's the long tail of it? It's become very short. And so this comes back to the business model. I think that there are creative minds at work still figuring out how do you develop a business model that works. And I'm going to give a shout out to Czech here in Victoria, because they figured out some business model that allows them to be producing local news content on a variety of different platforms, including this show, that other stations aren't. So there are creative minds at work, and I'm witnessing the changing landscape. I don't think that it's all doom and gloom.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you, Stu, for being with me and having this conversation where we're trying to figure out where it's all going.
My pleasure.
We'll be back in just a moment. And so I'm rather disheartened when I look at the media landscape. And it's not just here, all across North America. So back to the question I asked at the beginning of the show, does it matter? Surely good public policy depends on well-informed politicians along with a well-informed public. Let me know your thoughts on our YouTube channel. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.